Thanks, Estelle.
Hi everyone, welcome to the last digital conference session for GovHack. Before we begin, let's pause to reflect on the fact that we reside on lands of the world's oldest living civilization. I pay my respects to the peoples of the Eastern Kulin Nation, the traditional custodians of the land where I am streaming this event from. I acknowledge the traditional custodians of the various lands from where all of you are watching, and all Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples participating in GovHack. I pay my respects to elders past and present and celebrate the diversity of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people and their ongoing cultures and connections to the lands and waters of Australia. So today we will be joined by William Hughes, the Director of Economics and Population from the Department of Planning, Industry and Environment. Today's talk is Population Changes and Movement in New South Wales. Where are they and what are they doing? Thanks, Will. Take it away.
Thank you, and good evening, everyone, wherever you may be. Firstly, I'm going to give a bit of an overview of the New South Wales population and how it has been changing over time. And then I'll look a little bit more into some of those drivers of change into the future, and also what we're seeing with some of the shocks to population and how that's impacting, particularly around the pandemic's impact on population into the future. So just by way of introduction, there are three components, I guess, to population growth or change in throughout Australia, not just New South Wales. That is natural increase, so that's the difference between births and deaths, and the changes in population that occur as a result of movement of people. And that can be the movement of people in and out of the country, what we call net overseas migration, or net interstate migration, the movement of people in and out of states, net being the difference between the movement in and out. So if you look historically back to the mid 1980s, you can see population growth does fluctuate over time, and quite often that's a result of changes in that movement of people. But what is quite clear is population growth, I guess, since the mid 1980s has in New South Wales remained somewhat above sort of 1%, averaging sort of between 1 and 1.5%, and at times exceeding 1.5%. But if you look right at the end of this slide, and you'll see on the left chart, if you look right at the end, you'll see that population growth, that blue line, really declining sharply in 2020. And in fact, New South Wales population growth slowed from around 1.2% in 2019 to just 0.4% in 2020. And I guess the key driver of that decline has been the policy decision to close our borders and the large decline there in net overseas migration. If we look at it by states, New South Wales is not alone. You can see across all states, including, as you'll see the green line there for Victoria, a sharp decline in population in 2020. But if you look back to the mid-80s, you can see population between states fluctuates quite a lot. And you can see WA is always interesting because, as I'll touch on as we go through this slide, the movement of people can be influenced by many factors, and economic factors and jobs are often drivers of movement of people. And WA, being a large mining state, does see movement of people in and out depending on how that industry in particular is performing. So just looking at the movement of people in and out of the country and in and out of the state, again, this is really just unpacking what I was talking about in the previous slide. What you can see, however, is since the early part of this century in particular, is a very large increase in net overseas migration into Australia, peaking at over 300,000 people in the sort of around 2006-7, but staying well above sort of that 200,000 mark right through to 2020. Now, net again, I said, is the difference between people coming in and out. So obviously a strong growth in positive flows in that period. And the same is reflected into New South Wales. And a lot of that increase has been driven by temporary migrants, particularly students that have come in, foreign students that have come in to study. Net interstate migration, again, for New South Wales, has fluctuated over time. New South Wales, as you can see, is a net loss state. So everything's under the zero line there. The long run average been about minus 18,000. So we lose more people than we gain. Obviously, people do move to New South Wales, but we also lose people to elsewhere in Australia. And overall, we lose more than we gain. But that fluctuates as well. At different times, we lose more people than we gain. And I'll come back to that, the reasons behind that as we move forward. And just to unpack what's been happening in more recent times, obviously population growth in recent times particularly has been affected in Greater Sydney by the decline in migration. So most migrants, overseas migrants, move to Sydney, and you can see the impact on that grey line of the fall away in migrants, particularly in 2019-20. But overall, Sydney's population is exceeding 5 million for the first time. Growth in regional areas has been fairly consistent. The peri-urban areas, however, if you look just at the end of this slide, has seen a slight uptick, and I'll unpack that a little bit further as we move on, but there may be factors driving people out of Sydney in the last year that resulted in that uptick. And here's the components of growth between Greater Sydney, the peri-urban areas, and regional New South Wales on its own. But by peri-urban, I guess I'm talking about those areas immediately around Sydney, such as Central Coast, Newcastle, Illawarra, and Southern Highlands, Blue Mountains. So you can see for Greater Sydney, particularly the role that migration plays in population growth into Greater Sydney. So as migrants, international overseas migration has reduced that grey bar, you can see population has also declined. There is also some loss, obviously, due to internal migration from Greater Sydney too. But peri-urban areas has been showing an increase as a result of, and that orange component of the bar being internal migration. And you can see into the peri-urban areas, we've seen an increase in internal migration, even compensating for a decline there in overseas migration in 1920. In the regions more broadly, some increase as a result of internal migration, offsetting some decline there in overseas migration, but overall fairly consistent growth in the regions. So net loss of people from Sydney to the rest of New South Wales. I guess this is important as I was talking about early, we saw that uptick in movement to the rest of New South Wales from Sydney in 2019-20. And this slide here just brings that also more forward to early part of this year as well, to March 2021. And there's been an increase in the net outflow of people from Sydney to regional New South Wales. Now, you know, you've probably seen in the press quite a lot of news about people fleeing the cities for the regions during the pandemic. And well, that is probably getting reflected to some degree in these numbers, where both Sydney and Melbourne on this chart show an increase in movements to the regions. But for Sydney, it's still not a record loss. 2017 was the high point, if you like, of movement from Sydney to the regions, and that probably correlates fairly closely with the sharp rise we saw in house prices at the time back in 2016-17. You'll also notice back in the early part of this century, again, quite an outflow of people to the regions from Sydney. Melbourne's a bit of a different story. You can see generally outflow hasn't been terribly strong, but it has increased in more recent times. But there has been a pattern since about 2016 also of movement from Melbourne to the region. So it's not just related to what's been happening over the course of 2020, 2021. And we still don't know the full reasons behind why the outflow has occurred since the start of 2020, related, I guess, to the pandemic. But some factors might be uni students moving back home and studying online, renters opting to live in regional areas, and people moving to the regions because of the pandemic. Also, we've seen job vacancies rise in regional parts of New South Wales, and that might be driving people looking for job opportunities, and the ability to work remotely. The ability to work remotely might be another factor driving people to the regions, as well as people close to retirement who were considering moving out of the city, bringing that plan forward. And as I mentioned, moving to the regions, other indicators have, other than population, may be suggesting this may be occurring. And I'm showing you a few slides here on what's happening in the housing market. But if you see the red line there being the rest of New South Wales, and Greater Sydney reflected by the lighter blue line, you can see for both home values and for the rental value index, a sharp rise in rest of New South Wales. And we know the housing market in the rest of New South Wales is fairly finely balanced. So if you do see a slight adjustment in that market, be it people not leaving the regions or more people going to the regions, that would be potentially putting those markets out of kilter. You'll also notice an upturn in house prices in Sydney more than unit prices. And in a future slide, I'll show rental vacancy rates, but that may also be reflective of what we've seen in population within Greater Sydney over the last 12 months, where we've seen, with those border closures, less students and less temporary migrants coming in, be it skilled workers or even people coming out here for work contracts who would otherwise occupy inner city apartments. And so we've seen perhaps an increase in supply within inner parts of Sydney, but demand for housing on the outskirts of Sydney. So that pushing up house prices quicker than unit prices. And that's also, as I said, reflected in what we're seeing in the rental vacancy rate across Greater Sydney. So this is just Greater Sydney as a whole. And you can see 3%, the red line, reflects what we call a balanced market. Anything under that 3% is what we call a tighter market, or where the ability to find a rental property is reduced. So anything under 1% is a very tight market. So you can see the outer parts of Sydney having quite tight rental markets in particular, but as you move towards the more middle and inner ring where you've got more apartment development, you can see rental vacancy rates are higher and in fact above that 3%. And as I mentioned, in the regions where we've seen those large increases in prices and rental values, the rental market's very tight. In some cases, almost 0% or in fact 0%. And this and all areas in the regions are beneath the 3% balance market. So as I said, a very tight market. And is this reflective of people moving to the regions, or is it reflective of also people not leaving the regions? And we believe there's a bit of both going on there. People not leaving and more people arriving. And again, just showing you that comparison between Greater Sydney and the regions, where we've got that very tight vacancy rate out in the regions since the start of 2020. So moving to the New South Wales population projections. So to date, I've really looked at where we've come from and where we are today, and this is where we're heading. So the population projections for New South Wales are an estimate of future population based on assumptions around fertility, life expectancy, and migration at a point in time. So they represent the best demographic futures based on what we know at a point in time around the population. And these projections are used as a tool by government for the planning of services and infrastructure such as schools, hospitals, transport and community services. So knowing or having a view of what our population will be in 10, 20, even 30, 40 years time is important as we plan for the long-term provision of services and infrastructure for our people. And so future decisions around investment in land use and infrastructure will change based on what we're seeing with our vision for population. And it feeds into a lot of the strategic planning of government, such as our regional plans, our local housing strategies and state infrastructure strategy. So we last updated our New South Wales population projections in December 2019. So that was very timely, just before the world changed. And at that point, we were projecting the population of New South Wales to reach about 10.6 million people by 2041, up from around 7.7 million in our base year of 2016, the base year being the census year, the last census. And understanding New South Wales' future age profile is essential for, as I said, making those informed decisions around service delivery and infrastructure planning. And you can see we've compared the age profile of the New South Wales population at 2016 and 2041 based on those assumptions around in the projections. And I guess the picture, what we're seeing here is that, this is at the time we did the projections in 2019, we were expecting, I guess you can see more population overall, but importantly, changes in the population over time. So more babies, and you'll notice in particular an uptake in more older people. So the population of New South Wales over time is expected to age. And the young bubble that we see in 2016, as you'll see there between 20 and 34, that bubble, that little bump you'll see, which is related to the increase in migration into Australia, seeing lots of young people coming in. You can see by 2041, that becomes a bump in the older working age group too. So as I said, knowing what the age structure will be in the future based around our projections. So what we think will be the age structure in the future is very important for how we plan. So if we know we have, for example, an aging population, then we know we are going to need to plan for more aged care services, more hospital and ambulance services. If we know we're going to have an increase in the working age people, then we need to make sure we've got adequate infrastructures to service that part of the age group. And also more children and families means we need to make sure we've got more classrooms and open space. And so we need to plan for the schools we need to support a larger, younger cohort in time, as well as for the number of babies that are going to be born. So what is driving the New South Wales population? So this is, again, our projections, our assumptions around what we think is going to happen with the New South Wales population. Basically, that increase that I talked about, 10.6 million between 2016 to 2041, is largely balanced between an increase in migration, so arrivals, less departures, and then that includes both overseas and net interstate migration. So it's fairly closely balanced between migration and natural increase. Now that's for the state as a whole, and that can vary depending on which part of the state you live in. So just turning now to movement of people, nearly 40% of Australia's population changes address every 5 years. And the average Australian moves 13 times during their lifetime. Even that statistic surprises me somewhat. So why do people move? Australia's population is mobile, and that won't be a surprise to a lot of people on this seminar tonight. But there are a number of factors that drive mobility, and it changes with age and with key life events associated with your age. Economic drivers are also an important influence on movement of people. And I talked a little bit earlier about movement in and out of WA. So turning first to age, you can see earlier in life, particularly in those years around leaving school through into your 20s and 30s, age movement occurs quite a lot, driven a lot by education or jobs, young people moving for jobs, be it into different parts of the state or interstate. We also see after that people tend to be more settled as they bring up families, but then later in life you see movement again for other reasons. Retirement, people choose to retire in a different location, or as you get even older, moving into retirement villages, etc. So during the course of your life, you do tend to move for a range of reasons, be it economic, family, or later in life, age-related factors. And here I'm just showing this motivation for moving by age group, and again, younger people looking for either housing, for family formation reasons, or for employment reasons may well move. But later in life, it's less for economic reasons, but more for lifestyle and accessibility reasons. So retiring to a coastal area or a tree change area, or again for accessibility reasons into different forms of housing for aged care. And just turning back to that economic reason for move around employment and jobs, I talked a little bit about the WA moves, but New South Wales, again, moves are linked in WA. As I said, in New South Wales, I said we are a net loss to the rest of the country in terms of people. And generally that's associated with economic cycles, be it in New South Wales or elsewhere. And just turning to, I guess, the recession you saw in New South Wales during the recession in the late 80s, which saw interest rates reach record levels, you saw quite an outflow. You can see that real dip in people leaving the state. Conversely, in Queensland, which often mirrors New South Wales, because people from New South Wales more than anywhere else tend to go to Queensland, you can see almost the inverse pattern to New South Wales. So when people leave New South Wales, be it for loss of jobs or economic considerations or housing affordability issues, often they go to Queensland. And again, when the mining boom ended in WA in sort of 2012-13, and the economic conditions in New South Wales were very strong also improved around 2011-12, we saw less people leaving New South Wales for elsewhere. So again, economic factors are very important in shaping our migration patterns across the country. And also, moves within New South Wales also appear to follow certain rules. So for every one person who moves to Sydney, 2 people move from Sydney to regional New South Wales. So who moves to Sydney? Well, as you can see from that blue graph down the bottom there, it's young people, young adults coming to Sydney for education purposes. But who moves to Sydney, out of Sydney? It tends to be young families who move for lifestyle reasons. So sometimes you hear about people moving to places like Orange for job and lifestyle reasons, for example. Or you see later in life people moving for, as I mentioned, retirees moving for sea change, tree change. And those moves you can see up and down the coast and into some of the other lifestyle inland regions. So movement occurs at different stages of life, as I mentioned earlier, but there are some very, I guess, established patterns around movement as well. And even within Sydney, patterns seem to be particularly hard-coded over time. And we've seen that pattern of, I guess, westward movement in Greater Sydney over time as we've built more and more housing further and further westward in Sydney into the northwest and southwest growth areas, but also to the Central Coast, so moves from Greater Sydney to the Central Coast. And our primary data sources, like just capping off into our projections, primarily has come from the ABS, but also from the Melbourne Institute. And we also take information on net overseas migration from the federal government in relation to border details around migrants arriving through the state borders from overseas. So impacts of COVID-19 on population projections. So I'm just going to provide a little bit of information on how we see that playing out into the future. And most of this information I'm going to show you comes from the Federal Centre for Population and is available either at the Centre's own website or is available on the DPI website in our population area. So New South Wales population growth over the period from 2019-20 to 2030-31. I've shown you here the graph split by rest of New South Wales and Sydney. And this is comparing pre-COVID with a post-COVID scenario. So what the Centre for Population was estimating the population would grow pre-COVID with what its scenario is with the impact of COVID. And you can see the impact is greatest for Sydney compared to the regions. In fact, by 2030-31, the Centre for Populations estimating the Sydney population to be about 5% smaller than it was estimating pre-COVID. And again, the key factor driving this decline has been the closure of the borders. So we're not seeing migrants coming in who predominantly settle in Greater Sydney. That impact's not as great in the regions, but there are other factors at play too, which I will unpack in the next couple of slides. So there's the impact of migration, net overseas migration on population, and you can really see the impact there on Sydney with the decline in overseas migration. But it does bounce back and growth does recover. But natural increase is also impacted more in Greater Sydney than the regions. But there is a little bump there, as you'll see, in the regions of natural increase slowing down. And this is because economic uncertainty tends to result in people deferring having families or forming families. So our fertility rate and birth rate is estimated through the Centre for Population to take a bit of a hit in the short term as a result of the pandemic. But the longer term decline in natural increase, or the fact that it doesn't recover, is also related to the decline in net overseas migration. As I said earlier in the presentation, most of our migrants are young, and when they come in, and if they stay in Australia and become permanent migrants, they tend to go on and form families and have children. So the impact of closing the borders does impact the number of babies that will be born. And that affects Sydney more than the regions because, again, more overseas migrants settle in Sydney than the regions. Net interstate migration, so that's the movement of people from New South Wales and Sydney to elsewhere, again impacted again by the in the short term by the pandemic. And in fact, you can see for Sydney, a slight reduction is estimated there by the centre in movement out of Sydney and New South Wales to elsewhere. And again, this is partly related to the lockdown and border closures we've been experiencing, the state border closures, but also economic uncertainty and uncertainty more generally. People tend not to move when there's uncertainty. So they tend to delay moving until times become more certain. So that outflow tends to reduce in times of uncertainty. So that's all I had to present today. So I thank you for your time, and I'm not sure if we've had any questions, but I'll hand over to my colleague, Estelle.
Thanks, Will. That was a really interesting and informative bit about people movement within and out of New South Wales. We do have a couple of questions. What is the net loss per annum? And this is in reference to New South Wales, as you've covered net loss from Sydney to the regions already.
The net loss of people from Sydney to the regions?
No, from New South Wales to out.
Look, I may have to come back with that figure. I don't have every figure here in front of me, I'm sorry. But as I said, it has averaged around, I think I did have a slide there, I think it averages around 18,000 people per annum. But as I said, it has increased and decreased over time, depending on economic conditions in New South Wales relative to other states and other factors, but particularly related to economic conditions. But it has always, New South Wales has always been a net loss state, but that has fluctuated over time.
Thank you. We'll take the number on notice then. Another question, in reference to movement in New South Wales, because of people from working from home, is it anticipated that public transport usage will remain down?
Yes, that's a really good question. Right now, in the middle of the pandemic, public transport usage is way down. I think it's, I don't have the exact figures, but it's sort of at least more than 70% down on pre-COVID type levels. But in the longer term, there's a lot of, I guess, planning going on. As I mentioned, we do plan for the future, and there is a realization that the more mobility of the workforce to either work remotely rather than in the office is likely to have some impact on public transport usage. Exactly what impact that will be, there have been surveys of people's longer term intentions of working from home, and from that survey, I think there's a general view that people would like to work at home up to 2 to 3 days a week. So that is likely to have some impact on public transport usage. But again, we are also continuing to grow as a population. And so even if there is some slippage there, it will probably be made up over time.
Cool, thank you. And one last question. Are these net changes including immigration? So is Sydney's population smaller than it was in the 80s?
No, in fact, Sydney's population has continued to grow. We just ticked through 5 million people not that long ago. So we are going to continue to grow. There's nothing to suggest we won't continue to grow, but certainly the pandemic has had an impact on short-term growth.
Cool. Those are all the questions for now. Thank you for answering them. I'll hand it over to our GovHack people to wrap up the session.
Yep. Thanks, Will. Thanks so much. Lots of information, variables and factors, and great to see updates from the impacts of COVID as well. Thank you. And that's all we have for the 2021 GovHack Digital Conference. Thanks everyone for listening in.